Welcome, Gunrunner.
I've done a lot of videos on failed consoles over the years on this channel. It's always been a subject that seems to draw in the viewers, and just recently I was going through my back catalogue of story of episodes in the wake of being hacked and noticed that I'd made a video on failed follow-ups to successful consoles, but not the ones that continued the legacy of their predecessors by also being massively unpopular with consumers. So yes, that's what this video is, a look at 5 failed consoles that manufacturers hoped would rectify the failure of the existing console and turn around their fortunes. I mean, sometimes you have to wonder why they even tried. If a console brand is already tarnished, why try to make a successor that will no doubt be seen the same way? We can only wonder what the bosses back then were thinking when they greenlit these projects, let alone when they decided to actually release them rather than cancel them, like we saw the proposed successors to many other failed consoles like the Atari Jaguar II, 3DO M2 and Philips CDI 2. Now that we have that rather short intro out the way that sets the terms of this episode, it's time to get on with the show as I proudly present 10 failed follow-ups to failed consoles.
これがビデオゲームの最新鋭機種だ。スペースミッション、エスケープマン、コッピーバーグなどなど、君はこの新しさに遭遇したか。バンダイアルカディア。
Epic fail.
Let's start off with a console that should hopefully be quite familiar to my regular viewers, because I recently did a video looking at the best exclusives for the Emerson Arcadia 2001 and did explain a little bit about the console's history in the intro to that video. But for those who didn't see that exclusives episode, which I've linked down in the description, we should start by covering off that info again. First released in 1982 by historic US electronics company Emerson Radio, the Arcadia 2001 was actually an upgraded version of the advanced programmable video system, which would be more familiar to European gamers under a variety of different brands including the Interton, Radafin, Grandstand and Acetronic monikers. I've covered this system many times on the channel before, and I won't go back into its history too much here because it's quite complicated and I want to focus on its follow-up, but check the video links in the description if you want to know more about the APVS. In many ways, the Arcadia 2001 is not so much a successor and more an upgrade on the existing console, as it uses the same Signetics 2650 CPU but with more RAM, slightly better sound and an upgraded graphics chip. Like its predecessor, it was also licensed out to different manufacturers around the world, including the likes of Bandai in Japan, Leisure Dynamics in Canada, Hanimax in France, and Toshiba in Germany. However, unlike the APVS, most of these companies kept the existing Emerson design, just changing the badges and boxes, which fixed the brand compatibility problems of its predecessor. A few of these companies did come out with some pretty unique designs of their own, however, especially Toshiba with their cool looking Telefever console. The system wasn't very successful at all, certainly a lot less so than the APVS, which did have some regional success, particularly in Germany, and proved to be one of the first victims of the North American video game crash. But despite its market failure, it does actually sport a pretty decent library of games that includes a quite large number of official arcade conversions, including titles licensed from the likes of Tecmo, Konami and Nichibatsu, alongside unofficial clones of popular games like Defender, Missile Command and Pac-Man, and of course some rather interesting exclusives too, which I covered in the video I mentioned at the start. This means that the Emerson Arcadia 2001 is very much worth picking up if you can find one for a good price.
Epic fail.
Released in Europe in September 1993 to much fanfare, the Amiga CD32 was Commodore's replacement for the failed CD-TV, also being based on the existing Amiga computer, but in this case the new 32-bit AGA chipset, rather than the aging 16-bit hardware. Another big difference between the CD-TV and CD32 was that the latter was very much marketed as a games console, with some multimedia capabilities, rather than the latter, with with Commodore's own marketing very much aimed squarely at then European market leaders Sega. Commodore had clearly learned from the mistakes made with the CD-TV. It was a machine that nobody wanted because other than the CD-ROM drive it had no real advantages over a regular Amiga 500, yet cost twice the price. So they dropped the keyboard and the modular expandable design for a more compact and closed console case, but kept the CD drive and also made it fully expandable into an Amiga computer by offering the option of an external disk drive and keyboard. Of course, it was compatible with all existing CD-TV software, being part of the wider Amiga range. And the early signs for this new console were good, as the CD32 began to sell very well, especially in the UK. But Commodore knew that if their new console was going to be the success story they hoped it would be, they would also need to launch the console in North America, where they had previously struggled with the Amiga computers. Commodore demonstrated the NTSC CD32 at the World of Commodore Amiga show in September 1993, promising to have the console on the shelves in major cities by Christmas that year, with wider distribution going into early 1994. It would retail for $399, which is equivalent to nearly $750 in today's money, and would be backed up by a huge advertising campaign. Magazines of the time, however, were sceptical and believed that US games developers would be reluctant to support it. The North American CD32 was all ready to go, with consoles rolling off the production line, magazine coverage in the bag, and money allocated for marketing. But there was one huge problem. Commodore owed around $10 million in royalties to a US company called CAD Track for their use of their ZOR patent, and this company wanted their money. This led to a federal judge ordering an injunction against Commodore, preventing them from importing anything into the United States. Commodore had built up CD32 inventory in their Philippine manufacturing facility for the USA launch, but being unable to sell the consoles, they remained there until the debts owed to the manufacturers were settled. Commodore declared bankruptcy shortly afterwards, and the CD32 was never officially sold in the United States, although some consoles were imported via Canada and sold that way. Who knows if the Commodore CD32 would have ended up being a success, because its life was cut so short, only being on the market for just over 6 months. It certainly had some early momentum. However, I suspect that once more powerful 32-bit consoles like the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation arrived, its sales would have dropped off a cliff, and Commodore wouldn't have been able to compete anyway. Even its proposed successor, the CD64, had come along too.
Epic fail.
Next up, we have a pretty strange one, because all the other consoles in this video were released in their home regions as direct successors to the existing consoles, but this one only ever made it into territories where the original system was never actually sold, making it a really interesting but rather strange story that I'll endeavour to explain. Now, you might be sitting there wondering why RCA would even bother to develop a follow-up to the Studio 2, given it's widely regarded as one of the biggest console failures of all time and was obsolete before it even hit the market, thanks to the release of the more powerful Fairchild Channel F just a few months before, which managed to beat the Studio 2 to market thanks to a seemingly endless run of delays. But there is actually a method to this madness that all comes down to the fact that the Studio 2 could only produce black and white visuals. But this wasn't the original intention, you see, as the original designs for the console included a circuit to output colour. But at some point during its development, this was removed. Some have speculated that this was purely a cost-saving measure, but it's more likely that they couldn't get it working correctly for the proposed 1976 release date, and as the Studio 2 was already suffering from significant delays, they just removed it completely to get the console to market. The Studio 2 eventually limped out the door in January 1977, completely missing the massively important Christmas period, and with the colour Channel F already on the market, and the hugely exciting Atari video computer system just round the corner, it stood absolutely no chance. Now this last part is actually pretty important, because RCA were more than aware that the Atari VCS was on the horizon, and knew that they had to beat it to market if they were going to achieve any success at all. They figured that once they got it out the door, they could work on it further to get the colour circuit working and release that around the same time. And indeed, the RCA engineers did manage to do just that. But RCA themselves decided against releasing this enhanced version of the console due to the disastrous sales of the Studio 2 that saw them absorb huge losses. Rather than release a Studio 3, as it was quickly dubbed, themselves, they decided to license the hardware to two manufacturers in different parts of the world where the Studio 2 was never even sold. Sheen in Europe and Visicom in Japan. Both the Sheen M1200 and Visicom Video Computer System, as they were renamed, launched with new colour versions of existing Studio 2 games but failed to achieve any kind of market penetration at all in the face of the Atari 2600 and the raft of clone consoles that soon followed. Both of these systems are very rare and highly sought after by hardcore collectors, so your chances of playing on them are really slim. But having tried the Studio 3 out on emulation, I can confirm that you're really not missing much.
Epic fail.
We're going to take a very slight diversion for this next entry, because it's not actually a traditional home console and is in fact a handheld, in the form of the grossly underappreciated SNK Neo Geo Pocket Color, which of course is the follow-up to the original Neo Geo Pocket and, much like the Emerson Arcadia 2001, more of an upgrade on the existing hardware rather than a completely new console. Although even more so in this case as it's fully backwards compatible. Back in 1998, Japanese company SNK, who had been riding high on the success of their hybrid home and arcade system, the Neo Geo, saw that consoles were starting to take over whilst arcade revenues had plummeted. Their efforts to try and compete on a more even footing with the cheaper Neo Geo CD console hadn't really worked out how they hoped, but they saw another gap in the market that they hoped they could exploit: the handheld sector. At this time it was very much being dominated by Nintendo, as their biggest rival Sega had long since dropped out and Sony hadn't entered this sector yet. They figured they could come in behind Nintendo and offer something they couldn't, an arcade focused handheld, something we hadn't seen since the Atari Lynx. Despite both the internal and external hardware being totally different, SNK decided to reuse the Neo Geo branding to point at this arcade focus, and announced the Neo Geo Pocket. Released in Japan in October 1998 with a worldwide release planned for the following year, it arrived at quite a bit of unexpected criticism. Both the press and consumers alike were utterly dismayed to see another monochrome handheld arrive on the scene when even Nintendo had now switched to colour. Rather unsurprisingly, it failed to sell in any kind of significant numbers, and SNK made a hasty retreat and went back to the drawing board. Less than 6 months later, SNK unveiled the new Neo Geo Pocket Color, very much showing they had listened to all the criticism. A new version of the handheld that looked virtually identical, but now boasted a colour screen that offered up the same 160x152 resolution, but could now display 146 colours on screen and for a palette of 4096, and remained fully backwards compatible with all existing Neo Geo Pocket games. This made the new 16-bit portable very competitive with the 8-bit Nintendo Game Boy Color, being technically superior in every single area. They just needed to back it up with some system-selling games to really compete. This new handheld sold significantly better, prompting SNK to release the handheld in both North America and Europe later that same year. Before long, the Pocket Color was backed up by a rather small but undeniably excellent library of games, including exclusive handheld versions of popular SNK franchises like Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, King of Fighters, Baseball Stars and Metal Slug, as well as some great third-party offerings like Namco's Pac-Man, Taito's Puzzle Bobble, and perhaps most surprisingly, a special version of Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega. But this brief period of success didn't last, because it seems that Nintendo had an ace up their sleeve too. Price cuts to the Game Boy Color had already made it more appealing, but then the Big N announced their new 32-bit Game Boy Advance, and it killed off the Neo Geo Pocket almost overnight, with SNK discontinuing their handheld just 6 months later, exiting the portable market for good.
Epic fail.
For this next entry, I want you to concentrate on the Japanese half of this console, and the first part of its name, because while we now see Bandai as a hugely successful games company, mainly due to their merger with Namco, it wasn't always that way. And in fact, it was a really hard decision which Bandai console I was going to include, because every single one they released was a failure. There was the extremely limited Supervision 8000 console back in 1979, which was succeeded by a more computer-like follow-up in the RX-78, which was pounded into submission by the MSX. Their unsuccessful attempts to market Western consoles in Japan, like the Vectrix in Television and Arcadia 2001, which you already looked at of course, and the education-themed Terabiko, which was aimed at young children and used VHS tapes of all things. But I've looked at most of these in previous videos, which I'll link in the description of course, so that's what led me onto the Pippin, which has somehow never made it to the lair, despite being one of the most famous failed consoles out there. Now the story of how the Pippin came about is actually rather fascinating, because although the console came out in early 1995 in Japan, its origins date right back to early 1993 when Bandai had the idea to create a multimedia console based on the Apple Macintosh. This system was chosen because of its closed-in proprietary hardware that Bandai hoped they could license. The idea was to make a scaled-down version of the computer without the keyboard or expansion ports that would immediately boot from CD-ROM and connect to a regular TV. Unfortunately, despite much wooing from Bandai, Apple weren't interested and thought it would devalue their high-end brand. This snub led to Bandai hastily developing the Playdia instead, which was also marketed as a multimedia device rather than a regular games console. And this very much explains why the Playdia was firstly so flawed, having been rushed into development and subsequently hurried to market too, and secondly marketed and designed the way it was, as a multimedia machine rather than a regular games console. Released in October 1994, the Playdia featured some woefully underpowered hardware, with an 8-bit CPU at its heart in a world where 32-bit was now the norm. And it had a host of quite other big issues too. Firstly, it had just one controller, which only worked via infrared and required 2 AAA batteries, so if these ran out mid-game and you didn't have any replacements, you were screwed. And lastly, despite being marketed as an interactive multimedia system, it had no system BIOS of any kind, so if you turned it on without a CD in the drive, absolutely nothing happened. There was no way to play music, movies, or display photo books like other so-called multimedia machines of the time, like the Philips CDI, Commodore CD-TV and 3DO. It certainly wasn't a surprise to see the console replaced just a year later with a system that Bandai wanted to produce in the first place, the Pippin, so called that because of the Newtown Pippin Apple, a smaller and more tart relative of the Macintosh Apple. It seemed that Bandai never really had any hope for the Playdia and were happy to let it fail while they tried to talk Apple around, which they eventually managed to do. Part of the condition of allowing Bandai to produce the Pippin was that it would retain Apple branding and Steve Jobs' company would also be able to license the technology to other companies too. Indeed, not long after the announcement of the Bandai produced Pippin, it was revealed that Japanese electronics manufacturer Mitsubishi had also licensed the technology, although they would never do anything with it other than helping out with manufacturing. It was hoped that the new Pippin platform would not just be used as a games console, but also as a video player, set-top box, internet browser and much more, a true multimedia machine that could perform many tasks. And with the might of both Bandai and Apple behind it, the press of the era was convinced they would succeed, and the console was massively hyped from day one. But as history tells us, almost nothing went to plan. The first problem was that consumers didn't really know what it was. It was twice the price of the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation and lacked the games to make it attractive to that audience. It was very limited when compared to a regular PC, and because Apple insisted that the Pippin couldn't be converted into a computer or even marketed as one, so it wouldn't compete with their own Macintosh range, it was far too limited compared to its rivals in this sector too. The Pippin literally ended up being a console with no audience. Despite numerous attempts to rebrand it in different ways, with millions spent on marketing, there was never any serious take-up in either Japan or the West, with most people left wondering why it even existed in the first place. With just 42,000 units sold worldwide, it was an unmitigated disaster. In fact, with its global release in mind, I'd argue that it was the biggest failure in console history. Bandai blamed much of its failure on Apple, who they argued were never really behind the project, didn't do enough to support it, and handicapped it with their ridiculous list of controls. The Pippin was quietly discontinued when Bandai attempted to merge with Sega in 1997, and although that deal fell through, they made the wise choice to never re-enter the console sector again. And that rounds up my look at 5 failed follow-ups to failed consoles. Did you own one of these back in the day, or did you think about getting one and then change your mind? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube backers for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges: D. Vaughan, Albert Davis, Richard Baker, Martin Wiggins, Peter Grantham, Bird Santu, Mins, Classic Gamer 74, Josh Hartman, Donald Skronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsune, Grady Haynes, Paul Daniel, Seth A. Robinson, Climatorn, Carl Olsen, Mark Strickland, Big Chuzzle, Black Siren, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support this channel, then you can now join as a member for as little as £2 a month, where you'll get access to exclusive videos and updates and much more. Just click the button on my community page to get started. My Patreon is also still available if you prefer to support me in other ways too. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.